Thank you, Jared, for that kind introduction. I might stress that I am not the star of the show this evening. I am your TV host. And I want you all to get your questioning hats on. I always think these events work best when people interact with the speaker, and I know we have a fantastic subject in front of us tonight. Did want to say a few words, perhaps to frame up the questions that I think Wikileaks pose the media and society in general. So it's become somewhat fashionable to characterize an issue as the greatest moral challenge of our time. Experience to date suggests the use of such an absolute is somewhat fraught, that one person's great moral challenge, even if mandated by a prime minister, can and will be challenged, picked apart, and ultimately traduced in the absence of consensus or the presence of vehement and well-organized oppositional forces. It is for that reason I temper my language. One of the many great moral challenges of our time is whether or not we should trust government. And that, I think, is the core question posed by Wikileaks and its mediation into the public space of government-owned, I use the word wisely, secrets. And it is one that our speaker tonight, Kristinn Hrafnsson, Wikileaks spokesman, investigative journalist extraordinaire, addresses on a daily basis, and why I believe this evening's talk is so important in terms of both timing and content. Can I speak as a journalist for a second? Journalists love leaks. They are thrilling and they are necessary. They assist us to fulfill the unwritten, unspoken, and often unexamined contract between the media and the public. In essence, that journalists work in the interests of the public to shine a light on the truth, and in doing so, without fear or favor, make those in power more accountable for their actions and decisions. Sometimes such exposure changes policy and outcomes. In the journalist's mind, these changes are always for the better, especially at the point of publication. But every journalist who receives a leak will balance up the potential of the information leaked, its capacity to foster or provoke change, with the more vexed question, the motivation of the leaker. 8, maybe 9 times out of 10, this question will be decided in the favor of the leaker. The leaked information, once appropriate checks and related issues such as the opportunity for a rebuttal are dealt with. The urge to publish is strong and difficult to deny. But from time to time, the leaked information will never see the light of day and may remain in an editor's waiting room as issues of accuracy or motivation are dealt with. And there are a lot of grey areas out there. Political smears, for instance, are often dressed up as leaks. The source playing up to the journalistic vanity of getting a good yarn and letting the public know about some indiscretion, which means so-and-so is no longer fit to hold office. Or they may be part of a political strategy to gradually erode public confidence in an MP or an organisation and their decision-making abilities. These allegations can and often should reach the public arena, sometimes in a mediated or qualified form. But often they do not. I recently knocked back information that sought to prove the partner of a very well-known politician had broken certain business regulations The story, even if true, was not to my mind in the interests of the public. Editing is a process replete with human failings and bias, I would have to admit, but imperfect as editors may be, there are ethical standards and guidelines, and with due deference to the Press Council, we are a largely self-regulated mob, but our practices and approaches are honed, or have been honed, over decades of practice and experience. The same, I'm afraid, can't always be said of those who wear the mantle of the journalist in the new media space, where everyone can claim to be a journalist and/or an editor and/or a publisher. To my mind, Wikileaks brings these issues, and many more related ones, into sharp relief, and then takes the whole question of secrecy and its exposure to another level. Its contribution to free speech is undeniable. For that, it should be applauded and lauded. As the editor of when the Herald first published Wikileaks' Australian-related cables, and now the Herald's editor-in-chief and publisher, I have no qualms about defending the publication of the documents Wikileaks has attained in the interest of freedom of speech and in the public interest. But that said, how we define the public interest, how we distinguish between the interests of different publics and groups is as important as ever. There is also no denying that Wikileaks has helped protect journalistic sources better than we can in some instances in the absence of shield laws that work in every state and jurisdiction. And Wikileaks has exposed the abuse of power by governments around the world. But one question I have is there a limit? I accept that Wikileaks does not hack, but it is fair to say it endorses the hacker's desire to expose and share everything. By publishing Wikileaks, am I agreeing with the view that government is a conspiracy and that only by exposing its inner workings and all the speculations and opinions and chats and theories and personal views that go with it, by only exposing those things, will it ever better serve the public interest? Is all government a conspiracy, populated and prosecuted by an elite class of bureaucrats and politicians solely motivated by the exercise of power and their own reflection in its mirror? I am deeply perplexed by this question as, among other things, it goes to the very heart of the way political journalism is practiced in this and most other Western democracies. I have spoken to many MPs about Wikileaks, but one conversation with a senior political identity whose name I won't share has stuck in my mind. He was named in a Wikileaks cable published by the Herald and was none too impressed about it. He first raised the idea to me that we had somehow defamed him. We had not, but his real argument was something far more subtle. As he noted, he had been a real and valuable source for many journalists over the years, a constant wellspring of deep and important background briefings. These briefings had always been conducted under the conditions of an unwritten pact, the sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which of course fuels the world of political journalism. My MP saw this as part of his function in life, to provide insight into the workings of government and party alike, but suddenly felt disinclined to do so anymore with the Herald since we had so badly mistreated him. He, in essence, threatened to cut off the flow of information. Now, as you would appreciate, the idea of a Polly threatening a journo for going too far or not far enough is nothing particularly new, and neither is the idea that even the most frosty relationships eventually thaw. It is called mutual self-interest. But the rawness of the information contained in Wikileaks and its somewhat wild, personal, and uncontrollable nature proved a real threat to that relationship between journalist and MP. That Wikileaks is a threat to this cozy relationship is, perhaps, a good thing, but it is not one without consequence, and not just for the closeted world of political journalism. The questions for me are thus, would we have more secrecy rather than less if all the workings of the machinery of government can be exposed? And if so, would this make the job of journalism that much harder and provoke my profession to take even greater and greater risks and to potentially cross the line between public and private, all in the name of doing our job? There are no easy answers to this, and in many ways I think the jury is still out. But that is why I'm delighted that Kristinn is here with us this evening. Whether he is here as a witness for the prosecution or the defense is up to you to decide, and hopefully we can discuss with him later. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kristinn Hrafnsson.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for inviting me here. This is my first time to Australia, and my first serious experience with jet lag as well. When I arrived here and came out of the terminal, it was windy, it was raining, it was about 14 degrees Celsius. There was an ash cloud high in the sky, so I felt just like home on a good Icelandic summer day. So I'll probably get over the jet lag pretty quickly. I will speak about Wikileaks in general, the most recent and high-profile projects that we've been working on, our relations with the media, and some thoughts on the possible impact the organization has had on journalism. And afterwards, I'll be happy to take your questions. But let me begin with a few words on secrecy. A few days ago, the story broke that some hackers had broken into the computers of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and gotten access to some unspecified data. Most news stories I've seen on this are similar. They outline the gravity of this incident. Some reports claim that the data might be politically explosive. And in this report, in the English Independent, it is claimed that the IMF had become, quote, the latest and potentially the most serious victim of attack by computer hackers. The Independent claims that this grave incident has caused concerns that sensitive information about the finances of governments might have fallen into the wrong hands. And when I read this, I thought, hang on, what can possibly be sensitive about finances of governments? What can possibly be sensitive about macroeconomic data pertaining to a state? What possible harm can be caused if this information is, well, for example, available to everybody? We all know that the IMF is only called in when governments need a bailout. The IMF implements programs of austerity measures, privatization, selling of state assets, tax hikes, cuts in spending, etc. When the IMF is called in, everyone knows that the country is in deep trouble, and that's not a secret. But how on earth can information on the extent of the trouble and measures taken to counter the trouble be a secret? My own country, for example, Iceland, was in such a terrible trouble after a near economic meltdown in the fall of 2008 that the government had to ask the IMF to help out. And this is very controversial in Iceland, and it still is debated. And tell you the truth, I don't see whatever in the relations between the IMF and the Icelandic government needs to be a secret. And I, as a citizen and a taxpayer in Iceland, I feel I need to have a full account of all the information, correspondence and measures taken by my government and the IMF. Nothing in the relations between these entities is in the none of my business category. And in my opinion, the same applies to the citizens in Greece and in all other countries that have dealings with the IMF. It is their fundamental democratic right. In one news story I read, one reason for the supposed seriousness of this incident was that the sensitive correspondence between IMF staff and state leaders could be very damaging. But what on earth can be damaging? Would that be an email from the Prime Minister of Greece to Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the IMF? And how would that even read? I mean, what could be sensitive there? Would it be, "Dear Dominic, thank you for visiting our country. I hope you enjoyed our hospitality and our hotel staff"? Now, let's be serious. What on earth can be there that is sensitive between those two entities? I've seen quite a few articles on this story, and I'm amazed by the fact that I've not seen a single one that critically asks the fundamental question, why the need for secrecy? And even the left-wing Independent fails to ask this question. The reason is probably the fact that we have become so accustomed to the norm of secrecy in governments and secrecy by other holders of powers, big international corporations that are more powerful than many states. Secrecy has become the norm instead of being a rare exception. And this secrecy trend has escalated in recent times, all under the assumption that it is totally necessary for us, the citizens, to be kept ignorant, necessary for our own security. But we at Wikileaks disagree. We believe it is fundamental in a democratic society that citizens have access to all relevant information that they need to make an informed decision. If we, the people, do not have this access, democracy is flawed. And we know that power is abused. The more secrecy we have, the greater the danger is of abuse. A few words on Wikileaks. It's an organization founded by yours, Julian Assange, as you all know, back in 2006. And before the turbulent chapter in its history that started about 14 months ago, Wikileaks had published information from many countries, often uncovering corruption. These were material pertaining to the Kenyan government, the Church of Scientology, the failed Icelandic banks, the Bank of Julius Baer, toxic waste dumping in the Ivory Coast, and the list goes on. Despite the importance of this information and its revelations, the revelations went relatively unnoticed. This, of course, changed when we started publishing material pertaining to the US military and the US State Department. And then, subsequently, Wikileaks was criticized for being anti-American and overly focused on the United States. But nothing is further from the truth. Wikileaks does not pick targets. It is a passive recipient of material that whistleblowers can submit securely and anonymously. Today we have about 15 to 20 people on the payroll. I don't have the accurate number, as some are working on a short-term basis and others on a long-term contract, so this varies. So it's a small organization. Much has been said about the supposed lack of transparency in the organization, and critics point out that people who work for the Wikileaks are not known. A few of us who work for the organization are known, but it's true that the identity of most is protected. It would probably be different if we were working in different climates, but in light of the current attacks, we consider it essential to protect our people. And if you think about the heated words that have been uttered, where prominent figures have even called for the assassination of the core staff, including Julian Assange, I believe we are justified in this approach. Even Sarah Palin, who could become the next president of the United States, God help us, said that Julian should be hunted like Osama bin Laden. And we all know now what that means. But in addition to the core group of staff, we have volunteers that contribute some almost full-time to the organization, and very many can be called in to help part-time when needed. And yes, critics have said quite a lot about the apparent murkiness of our finances, but they haven't bothered to visit the website of the Wow Holland Foundation, a German charity that handled most of our donation and finances. On their website, you can find detailed information about our financer for 2010, donation and reimbursement of cost. A few legal entities have been established in various countries, for example Iceland, that have taken part in the Wikileaks project, or hopefully will be in the future. Wikileaks is a publisher, often described as the publisher of last resort. Some claim that it is impossible to keep the organization accountable. That is not entirely correct. Wikileaks has in the past had to face legal challenges and always won. We hear criticism that we do not abide by any code of ethics. Well, I do personally, as a journalist and a member of the Icelandic Federation of Journalists, and I believe Julian is also a member of Australian Journalist Association and is probably bound by its code of ethics. Also, Wikileaks has set standards of harm minimization in releasing information. It is, in my opinion, in line with what most media organizations abide by, or at least claim to abide by. And I think it's fair to say that most of us at Wikileaks adhere to the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The last year has been turbulent in the history of Wikileaks, and it started with the release of a secret military video on April 5th last year. It was released under the title of Collateral Murder and showed, among others, the killing of innocent civilians on July 12, 2007 in Alamin Thanya neighborhood in southeastern Baghdad. In my opinion, exposing this video was of historic significance, and it has become a symbol of the war we never got to see in Iraq. It shows the real meaning of the term collateral damage. 2 Reuters employees were killed in the attack, and the news organization was shown a part of the video. Reuters had been trying to get access to it ever since, and requested it under the US Freedom of Information Act. Pentagon has stalled for years, and obviously never intended to release it. The video is graphic and horrifying to watch. I felt as a journalist it was important to travel to Baghdad to gather additional information on the ground before the release of the video. In a hasty trip, I managed to meet the families of those killed and the 2 young children who were the only ones to survive the attack, Said and Doha. Their father, Matasir Tomal, was killed. His only crime was to stop his minivan to try to help a wounded Reuters employee, Said Sma. We offered this material, the interviews and photographs, free of charge to any media who wanted it. And I have to admit, I was quite surprised how little interest there was in the full story, in the human angle of those who testified about their loss and suffering because of this incident. Apart from a few TV stations in the West who carried a small part of this material and a couple of newspapers who used our photos, the story focused on the leak itself, not necessarily the story it told. And then instantly there was this massive focus on Julian himself. This was a revealing experience about the focus of the media, and I asked myself if we had gotten accustomed to completely block out the human angle to the war, at least the Iraqi human angle. Had we journalists become so complicit in the strategy of dehumanizing the Iraqis, possibly see all of them as insurgents, the enemy? And it made me think of how appallingly bad most Western journalists have been in reporting the Iraqi invasion and the war. And of course, this has to be seen in the context of the brilliant strategy of Pentagon of embedded journalism. Those who were not embedded were almost considered legitimate targets, and maybe they were legitimate targets, deliberate targets, excuse me. A few days ago, I was in Spain. I was talking to the relatives of Jose Coso, a cameraman who was killed in April in 2003. He was standing on the balconies of the Palestine Hotel in Baghdad, where hundreds of journalists were staying, and everyone knew that this was their place. when a crew of an Abrams tanks took aim and shelled the 14th floor, killing Jose and an Ukrainian cameraman that was working for Reuters. The family of Koso are still fighting for justice. Jose's brother told me they had produced a witness, a former US serviceman, who had overheard radio communication of the plan to attack the Palestine. He intervened and urgently warned all parties, but this was deliberately ignored. And this is just one of many devastating attacks by the Western forces on journalists in Iraq, the deadliest war in recent history for journalists. And this is possibly one reason very few journalists in Iraq go outside secure compounds and actually cover the story of the Iraqi people and their plight. The experience of the collateral murder release prompted us to rethink media strategy. It seemed that the best way of getting good analysis of our material was to make alliances with established media and promise them some level of exclusivity. And so we did in the next release that caused quite a stir, the so-called Afghan War Diary, the release of over 90,000 incident and intelligence reports from the Afghan War. The release was in cooperation with three media partners, The Guardian, The New York Times, and the German weekly Der Spiegel. 15,000 of the logs were withheld in order to protect individuals who could be identified. This was the biggest leak in US military history to that date. It gave a detailed picture of the war from 2003 to 2010. It revealed also the kill and capture unit of special forces who were hunting and killing Taliban leaders without trial, how the use of drones was increasing, how the opposition in Afghanistan was escalating their resistance with roadside bombs, previously unreported civilian death. In short, it showed how the military venture in Afghanistan had been going from bad to worse over the years. The invasion was a response for the 9/11 attacks, where more than 2,900 people were killed, but to date, more than 2,500 foreign troops have been killed in Afghanistan and more than 30,000 civilians. The Afghan War Diary told a terrible story that we had not before had a first-hand evidence of, the story of a failed mission. And just like the Soviets experienced before, there seems to be no victory to be had in this battered land. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, I've only been there twice, but one element that I always feel is missing in our reporting from the country is the escalation of the poppy growth and heroin production. 95% of the heroin sold on Western streets originates from Afghanistan. And according to UN agencies, 10,000 people die every year of a heroin overdose in Western cities. That is 3 times more than died on September 11th. With that in mind, I've always thought it almost surreal to see photos of Western troops wading through the poppy fields trying to find the enemy in hiding. And keeping in mind as well that at least some of the proceeds of the drug trade is financing the insurgents. All went pretty well in the cooperation with the media partner last summer. The timidity of the New York Times came as a surprise to me, though. It was obvious that they were genuinely uncomfortable with putting themselves in opposition to the government by publishing this material. And for one who had always thought that the New York Times was a powerhouse of journalism, this was a disappointment. This was not the New York Times of the early 70s when the paper took on the Nixon administration by publishing the Pentagon Papers from Daniel Ellsberg. And this was exactly 40 years ago. And I'm still not sure whether the paper was primarily afraid of repercussions or whether they simply did not want to upset a cozy relationship with Washington. And maybe it was a combination of both. The New York Times did, for example, not want to be the first to publish the material online, even though it was a matter of seconds. It was rather odd, as media organizations usually are fighting to be first, fighting for the scoop. We at Wikileaks were delayed by a technical problem, and this caused a great tension with the New York Times. They had the fingers on the go button, but waited anxiously for Wikileaks to publish first. Wikileaks' approach was to use these established media houses to get the message out, to get access to the dozens of quality journalists to analyze the vast material and mine stories out of it. We consider this a cooperation on a basis of equality. It was agreed that Wikileaks had a great say in the strategy of the release, as the organization was obviously going to take the heat for the publication. But it slowly became apparent that The Guardian and the New York Times saw things differently. For Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times, and David Lee at The Guardian, Wikileaks was primarily a source. What was disturbing, though, that those guys did not feel the same obligations towards their sources one is ethically supposed to do as a journalist, in my opinion. And this came apparent in September last year, prior to the release of the Iraq war logs. We wanted to expand the media exposure and get broadcasters on board. Originally, that was met with opposition, as the three print media thought they had agreed to full exclusivity. But Julian had to remind them that the exclusivity was limited to print. We got the Bureau of Investigative Journalism on board as a producer of television programs for Al Jazeera and Channel 4 in the UK. The Swedish National Television also made their own program, but worked in close proximity to the Bureau. At a later stage, the French daily Le Monde came on board, and also El País of Spain. Thus was created a media cooperation on a scale never tried before. This was a historic leak, but also a new chapter in media history. Never before had as many different news organizations cooperated on a single investigative project, and this was not without problems. There was a great mistrust, fear that someone would break rank and go early. There was also a great reluctancy to share findings and research, as had been the original idea and everybody had agreed on. The Germans at Der Spiegel were throughout very professional, I must say, and stuck to the cooperative spirit. They shared great news stories that had been missed by others. In late August, early September, it became obvious to us that we needed to postpone the release of the Iraq logs, originally planned to be released in mid-September. The primary reason was that we were working on a complicated method of redacting sensitive material out of the logs. The approach was rather unique, as it entailed defining on the outset that all the information in the vast material would be considered harmful until proven otherwise. This can be called a reversed process of reduction. But the approach was to reinstate harmless words step by step, so this was a complicated approach that took quite a time. David Lee at The Guardian had, for reasons of simplicity, been given the role of an intermediary with the New York Times and Der Spiegel. David was against the delay and played a rather silly political game in trying to stop it. All of this is, of course, not mentioned in his book about this project. There was even a threat to publish the stories without Wikileaks being able to publish the material it was based upon at the same time. Something was against our principles. And Lee was not at all concerned at this time about the interests of his media partner, Wikileaks, or if he was to look at Wikileaks as primary a source. He did not see any objections to compromising the source if it suited his interest. He even tried to play a game of poker by trying to convince me it was actually the New York Times and Der Spiegel who did not want to delay, a bluff that I called by simply contacting directly Bill Keller and the editors of Der Spiegel. We later found out that the New York Times had been in much closer contact with the administration prior to the release that we thought normal. This is not a kind of story where you need necessarily to give a right of reply. What was there to reply to? This was the publication of material pertaining from the Defense Department, the facts of the Iraqi war, as seen by the US military. The news headlines were quite extraordinary. The media partners had, of course, full editorial independence, and the flavor of their reporting was different. But it was interesting, though, that all focused on the story that the Americans were fully aware that the al-Maliki government was torturing detainees and did nothing to stop this, and even handed detainees over for torture. I say that all focused on this angle, with one notable exception. The New York Times decided to focus on Iranian involvement in Iraq. Overall, this was a sensational release, and a new chapter in media history as well, as I previously mentioned. Keeping the media alliance together was quite a task. This was sometimes like herding cats, which is an Icelandic saying. I don't know if you know that here. Everyone wanted to go its own way, not accustomed to work in alliance. And there was a great surprise the day after the first release when the New York Times decided to publish on its front page a profile on Julian, a profile that can only be described as a sleazy hit piece. Of course, the New York Times was in full right to do a critical report on Julian, but it was very negative and one-sided, and giving the unusual prominence of the front page. I say one-sided, as the author, David Burns, the London bureau chief, did not get any input from those working closely with Julian, me included. Even so, we were at the same venue at least 3 times in a couple of weeks prior to the publication of this profile. Instead, he sought out the people who would obviously give negative comments on Julian, and later Mr. Brisbane, who is the public editor of the paper, defended the profile, but admitted that it was a way of inoculating the paper, as he put it, from government criticism. And I leave it to you to judge how honorable that is, to attack the person who has given you access to sensational material in this manner. And later David Lee at The Guardian did the same thing in his book, which is, in my opinion, most interesting for what is missing from it. And in public speeches, he's been calling Julian crazy, narcissistic, deranged, and my favorite, a dirty, flaky hacker from Melbourne. So beware, this is the way The Guardian treats its sources. Of all the big leaks published by Wikileaks in the last 14 months, surely the one with the greatest impact is the release of the State Department cables pertaining from the US embassies and consulates all around the world. There are 250,000 of them. We call it the Cablegate Project, and it started in late November last year. The release and media collaboration has been in 2 steps. Firstly, there was the first release by primary media partners, most of whom I mentioned, and later we have been building an alliance with media in various countries where they get access to cables pertaining to their region. In some countries, we have made agreements with more than one news organization, and in others, the media environment is so untrustworthy that we had to rely on individual journalists, media from neighboring countries, academics, or research organizations. But slowly and gradually, we are getting the information out, as we promise our sources, with more and more agreements of collaborations being signed. And all in all, there are now more than 75 partners working on this material, and the project is continuing. This collaboration has been overall very positive and effective, as we are relying on local knowledge and local interest and expertise. This might be a slow process, but we are a small organization, and we try to be as careful as possible. We try to take care not to cause unnecessary harm to people. We have relied on the local in-depth knowledge of our media partners and on their evaluation of what needs to be redacted, names and other information that could be harmful. We revise the evaluation of our media partners regularly, and often we have reinstated information that they have decided to omit. Sometimes their evaluation has not met our standards, and they've not been able to explain why they redacted certain things. And there are also cases where a news organization has had to over-redact to protect themselves, for example, for libel reasons. I'm not going to dwell on individual important news stories. There are too many to pick from. Overall, it has shown that what the priorities are in US foreign policy and how it is carried out. Not always in the best of manners. Often dodgy deals are made or even threats. The cables have made diplomatic relations more transparent. The cables have also brought to light useful information from the host countries, useful and necessary for the people in these countries. It has to be said that the US embassy staff have been very agile in their information gathering role and have been in a good position to analyze the internal politics and economics rather well in the countries they are operating in. It has been suggested that the Cablegate could have a devastating effect on countries' relations. People would no longer be able to have confidential talks based on trust, But I believe this is a hyped assumption, and instead we will, and have possibly already seen, a more frank and open dialogue between state leaders. And that is the way it should be. Last week, for example, the US Defense Secretary Robert Gates was in Europe meeting partners in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it made headlines that he openly and without any sugarcoating harshly criticized the European partners for not pitching enough into the cooperation. And everybody knew that he was, of course, referring to Afghanistan. And I wonder if he would have been as blunt openly in a world prior to Wikileaks. The critics of Wikileaks have, as before, been quick to denounce the importance of the cable release. This is nothing new, they have said. Well, our media partners disagree. And try to tell this to the Tunisians. When the Tunisian cable started to surface in early December, they were translated and disseminated to the public in Tunisia. Stories were made on their basis by Al Jazeera and other news organizations. You did not have to tell the Tunisians at that time that the Sine El Abidine Ben Ali government was corrupt. But the extent of the corruption, with detailed example, was news to many. And maybe most importantly, it was news that the outpost of the State Department knew exactly what kind of leader Ben Ali was. But still, he was supported in Washington as a useful ally. The Tunisians did not like what they read, and the releases escalated the fury already in place in the country. It was the tragic death of a young IT graduate, Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire, that tipped the balance. He died on January 4th, and on January 14th, Ben Ali and his family fled the country. And the Tunisian example was an inspiration to the Egyptians. Information in Egyptian cables about internal matters in the country fed the flames. There was a big demand for Hosni Mubarak to step down. The United States thought they could interfere by suggesting that Suleiman would replace President Mubarak, but cables showing that he had been responsible for the torture chambers in the country did away with that possibility. And the so-called Arab Spring has spread. Amnesty International has acknowledged Wikileaks' role as a catalyst in the chain of events, and dedicated a good part of the introduction in the last annual report to discuss the exciting possibilities of the internet and information leaks. It concluded that last year might be remembered as a watershed year when activists and journalists used new technology to speak truth to power, and in so doing, had pushed for greater respect for human rights. I've not mentioned the release of the Guantanamo files, the reports on almost all the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, showing, for example, how appallingly bad information was used as a basis of years of imprisonment without trial, and often the information received through torture, leading to boys as young as 14 and demented old men being imprisoned for years. And Guantanamo is surely a black stain in US history. So Wikileaks has made an impact in our world. It has been a catalyst in the profound changes now happening in the Arab world. The leaks have deepened our understanding of the world we live in. It has excited ordinary people who were losing hope in their government systems and the media. Wikileaks has shown the traditional media that they were not doing the job properly, in my opinion, and needed to make amends after rather a bleak performance in the last decades or two. The idea Wikileaks represents has sparked the imagination and hope of people who really believe in democracy. They see finally the possibilities of the age of the internet delivering a better life for more people through their empowerment on the basis of information dissemination. But so how has Wikileaks changed the world of journalism? Let me give you a few examples. I think it has challenged the traditional media, and in doing so, has made journalists braver. Our work has reinvigorated journalists the world over to start ask the hard questions again. This is crucial because a free media is the watchdog of a free society. Wikileaks has revolutionized the traditional media by partnering with more than 75 traditional newspapers and other media outlets. It has forged a new model for how the media can work together collaboratively, not just in competition for a better reporting in the public interest. I believe we have encouraged the spread of data journalism, sophisticated analysis of large-scale data, such as thousands of war logs, to understand the bigger picture. Same sort of work an intelligence agency does, but the fruits are given to all the people of society, not locked in some hidden vault. And Wikileaks has enhanced the spread of new media. More than 20 new leak sites have sprung up in the wake of Wikileaks, including IndoLeaks, Balkan Leaks, Thai Leaks, EnviroLeaks, UniLeaks, and OpenLeaks. And now even the Wall Street Journal is copying the way Wikileaks uses technology to protect sources, and maybe not successfully. And Al Jazeera has done the same, leading them to acquire the Palestinian papers, a leak they actually shared with The Guardian. After practicing journalism for 20 years, I was getting less and less impressed with my profession, I have to admit. The idea Wikileaks represents has made me believe that journalism can again become an element that makes our world a better one. I believe it was Victor Hugo who said that nothing was as powerful as an idea whose time had come. And it should make us feel good to know that there are still ideas to be found that can have a greater impact for good, a greater impact than any military misadventures. Let me finally quote an Australian editor who in the mid-50s was defending his paper's right to publish secret documents. He wrote, "In a race between truth and secrecy, truth will always win." And this was your very own Rupert Murdoch. Thank you very much. Shall I go up with it?
Thank you so much. And we're going to go through some questions. And Kristinn, I guess you should come up with me because I think what Wikileaks does is challenge journalism and the way we think about secrets and the way, as we've discussed tonight, the relationship between governments and the media is conducted. And I agree with a lot of what Kristinn has said. I believe that it has perhaps taken journalism across the planet away from its perhaps cozy, as we've discussed, relationship with government. I think that relationship, as I try to explain in my introduction, is understandable. And I do wonder around the question of the information that Wikileaks provides us, and I'd like to hear some questions on this subject. Can you have too much information? Question one. Does that information simply just need to be put out there in the public space and let people make their own minds about it? Do you need journalists in that respect? I think Wikileaks has steered a very interesting middle ground around that, and I have every appreciation for Kristinn's description of it as herding cats. I also, I think a lot of what is passed in Wikileaks, though, has come, I think there's an interesting question around the impact that and the way the information is treated. A lot of the information we've published has been seen as, secret, exclusive cables, and as I say, journalists love a leak. So we love putting a big exclusive tag on it. And I think it's very incumbent, and I think the challenge to journalists is to mediate that information really closely, just simply because it's a leak, the inside of a diplomatic conversation that may or may not have gone any further than that conversation, or a cable from, say, the US embassy in Canberra to Washington. What is the status of that? And I do think that there's no, just because it's a leak, it doesn't mean it's a great killing secret. I think there's a lot of challenges in what Kristinn said, but and I hope we can have some discussion around that. I have a question. I'm going to kick off the questions with one from Lukasz from the Sydney University Media Department. Is there, I think, a microphone halfway down the hall? So do you want to nip down there and?
Hi, thank you for that very interesting talk. My question's on the very last point that you raised, truth. Some people would argue that truth is pure and universal. Other people would say that it's subjective, that it has shades of grey. So apart from trying to expose corruption and abuses of power, to what extent does Wikileaks present the truth, or can it present the truth or truths?
Well, that's an interesting approach, but I think however you look at it, you cannot find the truth without facts. So it's a philosophical question whether, you know, truth are facts or facts are truth. But at least I think you need to have the facts out to be able to figure out the truth. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
And I believe we have a second question from Wan Su. I think take a walk down to the middle, I think, if you could. If anyone else, if you are also wanting to ask questions, maybe we could have a bit of a lineup at the microphone just to...
Hi, Kristinn. Welcome to Sydney. And I'm a student from the medical department. And I work as a journalist in a very young newspaper in China. And my question is that it seems that journalists are facing a dilemma nowadays that on the one hand, we try to turn to the government for a more convincing sources. But on the other hand, I think government tend to fail the expectations from the public on the credibility thing due to the news management and even the propaganda. So what can the Wikileaks do for a solution? And as a investigative journalist as you, and what do you think can Wikileaks be used to solve this problem? Thank you.
You mean to increase government accountability?
Yes.
Well, by exposing the secrets of government, and I think that is essential. I mean, I think we have basically failed in the journalistic sector. I'm a part of the community. We have too many examples when you look back on where we were basically lied to. I mean, we were tricked into supporting an invasion in Iraq that was on the basis of lies and deception. And when that was uncovered, there were no weapons of mass destruction, and there was no Al-Qaeda link. The only argument that was left, well, we had to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he was torturing his own people. Then what do we find out afterwards? That we replaced Saddam Hussein with another guy who was continuing to torture his own people. So, I mean, we failed in the running up to the Iraq invasion. We should have been able to call the bluff. I mean, to point out the obvious lies that were being presented. And I mean, that's a blow to journalism, I believe.
It's an interesting point. I happen to be the London correspondent for the Herald and the Age when the report came out about the alleged weapons of mass destruction, and like I would say 95% of the journalists at the time were rushed off to print that there were bombs going to hit Britain in 4 minutes or whatever the time frame was. But at that point in time, there was no way, at that point in time you had to trust the government. So are you saying then that at that point
why did we have to trust the government?
Well, maybe we don't. Well,
we should always question the government.
That's an interesting question.
Because governments lie to us, all the time. We can't trust these guys.
No, fair enough. But what would be the alternative then? A government report came out, but we don't believe in it.
Well, I'm not an expert on weapons of mass destructions, and I'm not an expert on Iraq, but I'm sure we could have found experts who could have questioned these allegations at the time. And I mean, they were there.
Yeah, well, I think there was efforts to do that, but you know, it does go to the heart of the whole
agree that
question
we were too eager to take at face value the sensational story that you know, and I mean, there have been so many stories of that nature. You know, the throwing babies out of the incubator in '91 in the Gulf War, a fabricated hoax basically to garner support. So I mean, we are being lied to by governments all the time.
Do you believe that's because we desperately in the media want to simplify things such that it's always about good versus evil?
I think that might be one of the reasons, but we are also too eager to, for example, jump on a scoop if it's handed to us. So I mean, there are vulnerabilities there.
Interesting. The next question, I believe, from Fiona. Hello. I've got a light shining in my eye, so excuse me.
That's all right.
Yes.
Fiona Martin from the Media and Communications Department here, Kristinn. It's great to see someone other than Julian fronting WikiLeaks, I must say, and I really enjoyed your unpacking of the editorial move from passive recipients of whistleblower information through to reverse redaction, where you're actually having to sit back and work out what you can release without harming people. That seems to me to be quite a jump in editorial thinking. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how WikiLeaks' editorial values are fundamentally different from the media organisations that you've been working with, because you indicated that you weren't very happy with the way that journalists were handling sources, for example, like yourselves. So how is WikiLeaks fundamentally editorially different?
Well, I was pointing out this incident to point out that at that time I had really the hard task of trying to convince the Guardian to not to basically breach an agreement. And if this is heavily edited, you know, I don't know what heavily edited is. I mean, there is basically almost a 12-minute sequence without any editing, with a few comments in the beginning. But we also produced and put online the entire 45-minute sequence in the video. So I mean, that's one difference.
A world awash with information. The next question, I'm sorry, there was a setup, you might have noticed that I knew the identity of the first three questioners, but I don't know your identity, I'm sorry. So I wonder if you could just say, announce yourself and where you're from, perhaps, if it's relevant.
Yeah. My name is Marianne Wright. I'm a third-year media communications student here at Sydney. I was just hoping that you could shed some light on the way that you decide what leaks to publish, because I'd imagine, and Daniel indicated in Inside WikiLeaks, that you do get a lot of leaks. What's the process that you go through to decide, yes, I'm going to leak that, and what gets kept back?
Oh, you shouldn't read Daniel's book, it's ridiculous. It's mostly been ridiculed, and I haven't even read it, but all the reviews mention that two highlights of the book is that Julian stole his chocolate powder mix to make drinks, and that he played too harshly with his cat, so he suffered psychosis as a result of it. I've never seen Julian harm an animal, even though he lives in Norfolk, a lot of animals there, so I can attest that he's a nice guy. How to decide what is published and what is not? It is pretty much a journalistic call. It is what is decided on every editorial every day. When you get material in, I mean, how do you decide it should be published? I mean, it has to be something that has been suppressed. It has to be in the public interest to be out there. So, in my mind, it is a rather obvious task of evaluation of whether it should be exposed to the public on the internet. And I don't know, I have a terrible thing with the accent, so I might miss something out. But if you mention Daniel didn't want to some of his material to be published that we have published. He thought we were putting too much focus on the US, which is wrong. I mean, we had the material and we have responsibility and a commitment to the source who leaks this to us to get it out.
And is there a particular focus to, say, international, big, large leaks that have large effect, or are you thinking of publishing things of also of smaller effect in certain communities who would love to have, their cause helped?
Yes, I mean, we will, and but you also, if you're talking about the future, it is hard to see, where Wikileaks will be placed in the context. We now have a specialized leak website, and I hope, and we really encourage that, and I think it's a very good thing. The more the merrier. We are not fighting to, it's not a business model. We don't want to have, hoard the market. I mean, we are not for profit. And speaking of Daniel, he's been claiming for, ever since he left the organization a year ago, that it's all a big scam to make money, which is absolutely outrageous claim. And
thank you.
It says a lot about the claims.
Hi, my name's Martin, and I'm a student here at this university as well, but not in media or journalism. My question is to the idea of what information to release and what not to release. And obviously it's a very big question. So I'm just going to pick out two of the case studies that you looked at, which is the International Monetary Fund being hacked and the diplomatic communication stuff that was released. Okay, so basically, if we entertain the idea that governments sort of work like private enterprise, then we draw the similarity of this operation with private enterprise and them having secrets. And we know that secrets are important in companies because some people might have information and then act on it and derive some sort of benefit from it. And this action is actually made illegal by the crime of insider trading. So obviously, secrets in private companies are important for, tactical interest in economic transactions. So governments would obviously need this sort of tactics of benefit when they're negotiating with private enterprise to get a service or with other government bodies. So given that this isn't something that, everyday journalists or everyday public citizens will know about, how can you sort of mitigate the risk that something you're releasing is actually going to be stopping the government from doing something that's in the benefit of that's in the public interest, yep. And in doing so, unwittingly sabotaging what they're trying to do?
Yeah, good question.
It's a very good question, but it's a bit hard to answer if it without relying on some examples. But I disagree with looking at governments in fundamentally the same way as private enterprises. I mean, there are other concerns when it comes to governments.
Perhaps as an example, we could use the IMF story you put up.
Yeah, I mean, what on earth would compromise? I think it's something that has to be balanced. The benefits of keeping it secret, possibly, and getting it out. I mean, and it's something that has to be evaluated. And I think on almost all occasions, the evaluation would be on the side of getting information to the people. I mean, what could it be? I've been covering the IMF a lot in Iceland. I've been thinking a lot about what on earth could be there, and what on earth could be in the negotiation between IMF and Greece, for example, that is sensitive. I mean, is it about the selling of resources, or the water company, or which is a very, very heated debate about. So it might hurt the possibility of getting the highest value for the national power company of Greece when it's sold out and nationalized, because I mean the discussion was known. But the people have a right to know this is being planned and being possibly suggested by the IMF. So you understand my meaning? It's something that has to be weighted.
I understand that it's a balance, I suppose, but I guess it's a very difficult balance to arrive to, and it seems it will be difficult and possibly dangerous to have just someone arbitrary sort of defining that balance, I guess, without
having the actual party have some say in it, which is the danger you risk getting if you just had an independent body such as yourself sort of deciding what to release or not. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I understand your point. I think it's very much a journalistic question. I would like to ask you, what would you think?
Well,
how would you get information that might actually hurt the deals of selling of bauxite to...
I have no, and I think we'd both agree on this, that I think the public would have, for instance, if you were talking about, say, electricity privatization or water privatization, I think we have an absolute right to give people all the information they have.
Not just a right, a duty.
A duty, absolutely, a duty and a right. I think the question that comes to it is, I think the follow-up question is around what does the public, are we getting a more informed public, a more informed polity, and what is that information doing for the nature of the democratic process? And I also have a sort of, it was great to publish that story, what was the result of it, and I always think that's the way you measure it, and I'd be interested in your view on that, actually.
Well, I think the information to be out there has a value in itself, and it should so we cannot always value it on the merit of a possible outcome. I mean, it's not for us to decide. I mean, knowledge should be owned by the people. But people do have a right to know.
I mean, in a way you don't, because you put it all out there. So
yeah, I mean, we have yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on. Next question. Sorry, you've been very, very patient.
Thank you. My name's Nancy Kleinig. I'm here as a student of the university. I'm interested in how WikiLeaks chose its media partners. Obviously, the release of that information to certain outlets advantaged some organisations over others, and I'm just interested to know how WikiLeaks came to make the decision as to who to work with.
Well, I can say that after our previous experience, we choose them carefully now. No, I mean, it is on the merits of the media outlets. It's some of the work that I've been doing is going from country to country, try to find a trustworthy partner. Sometimes you cannot find one. Sometimes you have to wait. There is a political balance. So you make alliance with two newspapers, for example, etc. Sometimes you can't just simply find any trustworthy media. So it's a difficult thing, but we have tried it carefully, and we have been criticized. You know, for example, El País of Spain was originally doing a lot of stories on Latin America, and we heard a lot of criticism from Latin America that their focus was not in the best interest of people there. They were not agreeing with how they focused their selection of story and how it put it forth. We did put a great emphasis on finding local partners in that region because they were closer to the stories and knew how to process the information. But it varies from region to region and country to country.
How important do you think the media, because what you're doing is buying into a brand, so New York Times, Guardian, what have you, City Morning Herald, the credibility of the individual brand that goes with it, and giving you also a superstructure to enable you to publish. But given that you have now established WikiLeaks as its own brand, do you actually need to partner up at all?
Not so necessarily, and I mean, I think in the ideal world, the best the way to go forward, it would be, in the ideal world, we basically just put the material out and everybody would go for it and work on it. Some stories might be of that nature, but I mentioned my disappointment with the collateral murder video and that story. So we found, and I know this is quite natural, because I worked in that community, that when you have exclusivity or some level of exclusivity, you put more emphasis on it. I mean, that's just the way it works. You have to play a little bit by the rules of how journalism is in the world. But I mean, I was asked about how about stories of more localized and regional impact, and this might be a network that we are establishing all around the world that we might use in the future to get information out that has a more local angle more local emphasis.
Okay, terrific. Next question, please.
I just have a pretty direct question. Why is the submission box closed? And is the security model of WikiLeaks leveraged off the knowledge in Julian Assange's head, or can it be open sourced?
Sorry, could you give me the rest?
The first question is, why is the submission box closed?
Yes, I knew that. Yeah, got that.
The second question is, is the security model which WikiLeaks operates on leveraged off the knowledge, like on a need-to-know basis? For instance, there's certain things that you can't disclose about the security model. Or can it possibly be open-sourced, like public key encryption, certain, PGP and things like that?
Well, I'm not a computer expert, so I can't go into details with regard to that. But I mean, it was sabotaged by the 5 people that left their organization last year. But we did not put a great emphasis on opening the Dropbox. It would take some time in coding, which I know little or nothing about, basically. I can hardly operate this computer. We do not put a great emphasis on that project because we were sitting on such a vast information that we had to get out. And being a small organization, Julian being under the virtual house arrest for quite a bit of the time, our finances being limited because of the attack by Visa, MasterCards, and Bank of America, and PayPal. We decided that we do not put an emphasis on opening up because we have a lot on our hands already. So that's the primary reason.
Next question.
When I visited the WikiLeaks website several years ago, it seemed as if WikiLeaks would simply make leaked information available to the public and let them do whatever they want with it. Whereas it seems that nowadays they actually actively seek publicity for this information and have an opinion on it and a particular stance. Do you agree that such a change has happened? And if so, why was that change made?
Well, I tried to touch that issue in my talk. Yes, I mean, there has been a change with actively working with the media and promoting the material to try to maximize the impact of the, I mean, to get it, by maximizing impact, I mean basically get it to as many as possible. Some of this stuff that was published earlier, prior to my days, I haven't only been with the organization for a year and worked with Julian since February last year, there was a different approach. So, I mean, yes, I mean, the WikiLeaks has evolved, but it is in line with trying to get maximum impact with the information.
Apart from seeking publicity for information, do you think WikiLeaks now has more of a stance and an opinion that it's trying to put forward?
Sorry, more of
a stance and an opinion that it's trying to put forward, rather than being
no,
completely neutral?
I would. You're probably referring to us being anti-American and trying to attack the U.S. But no, I mean the politics in there are pretty obvious. I mean it's democratic principles that we are adhering to and believing in transparency and integrity in a democratic society, and that people should be informed and that information should be free. That is a remnant from the elements of the hacker community that Julian was growing up in back in Melbourne 20 years ago.
Thank you. I wanted to jump in with a quick question here. I actually enjoyed your comment about the NYT running a very critical commentary piece or profile piece about Julian. Yeah. I can understand why they did that. I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but I can understand fully why they did it, because they were worried, as you say, that they might feel like the New York Times had sold its soul to WikiLeaks. But I was interested in what your opinion on what you saw as the emphasis on Julian and Julian Assange's trial and the tribulations of vis-a-vis Sweden and what have you. Is that a positive or a negative, do you think, in terms of the organization?
Well, it's a mixture of both, but we just can't change the reality of the media world. And it irritated Julian greatly when this was there was this sensational emphasis on the this romanticized Julian story back in May, June last year. I mean, he came to the point that he denied to give any interviews unless there was a focus on what Wikileaks was doing and what it was publishing, not on himself. I mean, he didn't like that at all. So, I mean, we try to change that, but this is the way media is. I mean, it is very much centered on individuals and personalities. Bit of a sensationalism there. But then again, you have him as a main spokesman, the editor for the organization. A very bright guy that Australia should be proud of. So it's a double-edged sword. I mean, he has been then, of course, the sort of lightning rod of WikiLeaks, you know, getting both the praise and the criticism, and, as he has put himself.
Next question.
Hi there, my name's Patrick and I'm an engineering student. I'm also a large contributor in the open source domain, which I feel has a lot of parallels with WikiLeaks and the idea of information being free and open. I think that seems to be the idea of WikiLeaks, whereas, as we've already touched upon, the press kind of can put different ideas on stories and just try and tell stories as opposed to give the information. My first question was going to be, are you looking to distribute information without the press, which you've already touched upon? But my next question is, have you seen any change in the press since WikiLeaks came to being, and how are you sort of how's your relationship with the press to try and improve how they tell stories?
Well, there's certainly been changes in the relations with the press, and I feel that there's more and more acceptance of what we are presenting in the press. There was a lot of skepticism to start with, and almost with journalists and the media was almost saw us as attacking their turf, and there was a reluctance to admit that we were a part of that community, the journalistic community, and a new sort of element that was added into it. This has changed, and there's a more and more acceptance that this is a new reality. I was asked this morning by a journalist here, so do you think, Kristinn, that you will ever go back to mainstream journalism? And I said, you know, I'm doing journalism, and you know, the journalism will come WikiLeaks way. So if I just stay on the track, it will become mainstream. I think that's going to happen.
So you feel journalism and the media will stick around, but it'll just have to change it'll just have to change its ideologies as opposed to it just disappearing completely and having a different method?
Yeah, I think the idea of what journalism entails is changing.
A sort of related question to that is, do you think journalists, faced with this sort of flood of amazing information, or a lot of it amazing, will have to take more risk? It's sort of WikiLeaks, in a sense, raises the stakes, and as journalists take more risks, let's say phone tapping for the current issue, as journalists, does it then become more at risk of compromising its ethics in the kind of, because you need to get all this information out?
I don't necessarily think that journalists will have to compromise any ethics, but be certainly more critical and maybe seek out actively to be a more call for information of this nature. And you know, it remains to be seen how this will affect actually leaks in the future, whether there's going to be a flow of information. But we can also encourage it by legal means. I'm impressed by the initiative of my media here that have come together in the campaigning that they're doing. The right to truth, is it? Yeah, right to know, which I think is a very impressive initiative. Also with Whistleblowers Act, protecting whistleblowers, and I mean, we as journalists should, you know, be activists in the field of promoting these kind of policies, and thereby opening up the gateway for more flood of information. Let's hope so.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, Kristinn. I'd just like to ask your thoughts on whether you think that in the quest for complete transparency, in organisations, the very existence of organisations such as Wikileaks may actually increase secrecy within internal communications of governments and non-government organisations?
Yes, well, I don't think that's going to be a problem, because there will be, there's always, in all bureaucracies, you have to have information stored electronically, and it will leak out. So I don't believe that this is going to cause more secrecy. And well, in general, I think it's going to cause just a healthier environment.
It's interesting to pick up on your
But
point.
sorry, but I've heard a lot about this criticism, but I've never heard the actual argumentation why this should happen. Why would government officials feel a need to, start meeting in small smoke-filled back rooms or in car parks somewhere?
Well, I guess, I mean, where there used to be secret and not secret, there might be leakable and not leakable. So that the not leakable stuff is really only shared between the core group of people who would be personally affected if something was leaked.
Well, we have to see the evidence of that, but I think in general, I mean, basically people will start to behave more ethically because they are afraid that something will leak out. So,
Yeah, my observation on that, for what it's worth, and it is only anecdotal, is that, say, for instance, the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra, the circulation of emails has become more restricted, and there are more private meetings that are not recorded and all those sorts of things. So, whether that's a direct result of WikiLeaks, it could possibly be. So, in other words, the information is actually getting tighter held because, of course, WikiLeaks embarrasses people.
Yeah, well, it's I don't know the specific examples, but in general, I think it's not going to make a huge difference.
Okay. Next question.
Hello, I'm a blogger. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate what you're doing and what WikiLeaks is doing for the world. I think open government is a very good idea, and I would like to see no secrets held whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you.
No. Thank you. Well, next question.
Hi, my name is Daniel from University of New England, and I just want to say that as ordinary people, we actually choose not to be ignorant, but it's quite time-consuming to do all the researching to find out the truth. So I was wondering that what would you recommend that we as ordinary people do to find the truth?
What should ordinary people do to encourage more open society and transparency? Well, I mean, that's the question it's a political question. But, I mean, there are, I mentioned the 2 programs that are going on here. Well, I can tell you what we in Iceland did, for example. I don't know how familiar with Iceland. It went through a total economic meltdown in 2008, and despite the fact that a year earlier we topped the list of Transparency International, which is a total joke. And I sent an email to Transparency International asking me, how on earth could you measure, I mean, how do you go wrong? And they never replied. I mean, it's ridiculous things. I mean, we basically suffered a banking fraud on a phenomenal scale. I mean, the banks were 10 times as bigger as the country's economy. They had 10 times the turnover than the GDP of the country. So the entire collapse was great. What people basically did, they went out on the streets and they demanded total transparency. And therefore I mentioned, for example, the dealings between the IMF and the government of Iceland. I mean, I'm fairly certain that there's not a shred of paper that is marked top secret in that respect. It wouldn't be tolerated. But we had to learn the hard way, and now there's legislative reforms, media concerning the media and the freedom of the media, and even the constitution is being rewritten because we saw that our democracy was flawed. It did not protect the individual, and we lived in a fantasy world that we were a rather healthy, westernized democracy with full transparency, and we were hailed for doing that. And and everybody got it wrong. You know, the rating agencies, the banks are fantastic. They had been eating up from the inside. They were a house of cards, came crashing down. You know, taking people's houses away. You know, halving the currency in value. Maybe it takes a shock like that to basically realize that you have to, in every means, fight for transparency in order to hold the government accountable. People went to the streets in Iceland, threw stones at the parliament, threatened to burn it down. It was a real possibility in a country that has no history of political violence. I mean, people rarely, go out to demonstrate. You know all the 20 demonstrators whenever there's a demonstration in past history. So people just had enough. So you learn by the hard way, but it could be an example. But this is a general thing about politics, I think.
Thanks.
But
I think we have 3 final questions, so we're the lucky 3.
Right, good to be the lucky 3. Thank you for your talk, Mr. Hrafnsson. And I just want to ask you, in face of the freedom of speech that the US has and the Western world, I think, has so proudly it possessed over so many years, have you or any member of Wikileaks ever felt endangering yourself in disclosing or in evaluating any of the cables that you've reviewed?
Whether we have felt endangered by working on the project of exposing this material?
Yes.
Yes, of course. I mean, it is quite a serious threat when you have political commentators and politicians urging for the assassination of your editor when it comes to Julian, and people of the organization being hunted down like terrorists. So you feel a sense of threat, but it shouldn't intimidate you. But I don't want to say that we make us sound like any heroes. I mean, certainly people who are working in war zones are risking their lives as well, but greater dangers probably. If you ask me personally, I have not seriously felt that I was in danger because of working with Wikileaks. But I will not fly through, Kennedy Airport in the time being. So, and I'll have to take my children to Disney World in Paris instead of Florida if they can twist my arm to take them to Disney World at all.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, that was loud. My name's Rachel Bolton. I'm a journalist, mainly with Fairfax. But I wanted to ask you a question, and I hope you don't find this offensive. But Julian is often referred to in the media as a journalist, and I know that you are a journalist yourself by background. But I do question where you draw that line between source mediator and journalist.
Great question.
Well, I basically draw a line of what people are doing if they're abiding by journalistic rules and practicing journalism. A lot of my colleagues in the best journalists that I know have no journalistic training, and they didn't go to uni to get a degree in journalism. But if they abide by the principles of journalism and what I believe are the basic principles, they have a right to call themselves journalists if they are working in the field.
But in terms of end product, I mean, as a website that mainly produces sources that would be used by third parties to write stories, for example, do you think that that we can expand the genre of journalism to include what is effectively making sure that sources are fair, which is what I understand you to do?
Well, I think prior to the beginning of the big releases starting last year, I think Wikileaks was doing more journalism than actually it has been doing since, in a sense, because I mean it was not relying on the cooperation with the modern media, traditional media. So I mean there was the element of receiving information that had to be analyzed and put into some context and put on the website with a summary, which is basically a report written on the material. But with the massive information that we've been working on for the last 14 months, we have delegated that somewhat in the cooperation with the traditional media.
Okay. Thank you.
So I mean, it's one world, but and we might go back to working more on by ourselves on the material that is submitted to us. That's a full possibility.
Interesting. Final question for this evening.
Yep. Hi, my name is Rodrigo, and I mean, to me, it's quite clear that Wikileaks is becoming really important for the world, and it seems that Wikileaks relies too much on Julian Assange. And I'm wondering, what would happen to Wikileaks if Julian is not able to lead Wikileaks anymore? I mean, if it goes to jail or if he's murdered or something like that. Yeah, it's a problem that can happen. It seems that can happen. So what would happen to Wikileaks if Julian is not able to lead
what
it
happens
anymore?
To Wikileaks
It's very hard to hear bouncing off that.
Yeah, the echo is great. It's probably good for Gregorian singing.
We'll do that. We'll do that later.
We'll do that later. Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. Basically, I mean, of course, he is very important for the organization as it is now functioning. But I mean, he was put in jail in London for about 11 days. If we still went on going with according to the same plan. But the way I see it is that in some ways the ultimate goal of Wikileaks might be to make itself redundant. If journalism changes to incorporate that ideas, if the idea spreads so much that you will have anonymous Dropbox on every website, on your website, and we already have these topic-based regarding to environmental concerns, things like that. But so the most important thing is that the idea is out there, the cat is out of the bag, as it said. So it's spreading, and that is the something that is the biggest achievement, I think, by Wikileaks. So it doesn't have to exist. I hope that Julian will not cease to exist. But I'll put it, the organization would function in some form, I'm sure.
Yeah, I just wonder if
but
there is
with or without Julian, I'm sure it will progress in some manner, and it will change probably over time. I mean, Wikileaks is today not the same organization as it was last year, just simply by the learning curve and by what we're going through.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there is a plan going on inside Wikileaks, because Wikileaks is too big now. It can't rely on one person. So I was just wondering if there is a plan now inside Wikileaks to overcome a situation like that, if it happens. That's it.
Well, I mean, we don't have a specific plan in place, but this is but I mean, the good man says it's always hard to predict, especially the future. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No. You might want to get together after. Sorry. Thank you very much for all those questions. I'm going to hand back to Jared to thank our star guest tonight. So thank you.
Why don't you, if you just stay here for a minute, that would be okay. So it just falls to me to briefly to thank various people, particularly Meredith Hall and Sydney Ideas, for organising this tonight, especially to Peter Frey for hosting and for, I think, being an excellent interlocutor and brought out a number of really interesting aspects. And especially I wanted to thank Kristinn Hrafnsson for his generosity. And I think particularly a university like this one is very much a place where we are very interested in ideas. We believe in the importance of ideas. We connect those to freedom. We connect those to notions of democracy. And I know you've heard tonight from students across different faculties of the university. Many of us in our courses, particularly in media and communications, Wikileaks is a fabulous case study for us. And it's very inspirational, I think, for many of us. And we also have many questions to ask of Wikileaks that we've asked tonight. So I really thank you very much. It seems ironically our two countries, Iceland and Australia, both have an interesting stake and place in what Wikileaks. So we thank you, and we wish you very well for the interesting adventures of Wikileaks in the future. And thanks also very much to the audience tonight for your participation. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.